I'm Caris Roberts and I'm Executive Director at IPPR, and I'm delighted to introduce this event on the Environmental Justice Commission that IPPR has produced and the plan for a cleaner, healthier and fairer economy. We are competing with some drinks receptions, I think. However, we do have wine at the back, so please do help yourself. And we'll make this as free-flowing a conversation as possible and get everyone involved. So consider this your warning to prep your questions. So in terms of today, we're going to have a brilliant set of speakers talking us through the topic. We're going to start with Luke Murphy, who's Associate Director at IPPR for Energy, Climate, Housing and Infrastructure. He was also the head of our Environmental Justice Commission, which he's going to be telling you about in just a moment. We have Laura Sands, who was co-chair of our Environmental Justice Commission and is a senior independent director at SGN Network and has recently been appointed chair of the BEIS Ofgem Energy System Data Task Force. She's also founder of the Food Foundation. I won't read out the whole thing, but I do like the Food Foundation, Laura, so yes. I'll read that one out. We have Sir Bernard Jenkin MP, who is Vice Chair of the APPG on Net Zero and has been a Member of Parliament since 1992. We have Isabella Gornall, who is founder and Managing Director of Seahorse Environmental. We have Sam Hall, who is Director of the Conservative Environment Network and a former policy advisor to Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. So it's a great set of speakers there. Given that they are the experts, I'm going to hand straight over to them, starting with Luke.
Thanks very much, Caris. As Caris said, I was head of the Environmental Justice Commission at IPPR, and the commission was a cross-party commission which brought together Laura and Caroline Lucas from the Green Party, and she won't thank me for saying that, and Hilary Benn from the Labour Party. And it came together with a kind of a central mission, and that was to set out a plan of how we address climate change, protect and restore nature, while also spreading opportunity, levelling up, and creating jobs and businesses across the country. And the different thing about the Commission was really that we held 4 citizens' juries across the country, primarily because the chairs, Laura included, as well as the commissioners, which were drawn from business, civil society, trade unions, and activism, were clear that they wanted people to be at the heart of this transition, and they didn't just want to call on government and policymakers to put people at the heart of policy making and tackling this challenge, but actually to do it ourselves. So we held 4 citizens' juries in places around the country which face particular challenges as a result of the transition. So that's Aberdeenshire, oil and gas and farming, Thurrock, which is a commuter town and is also an area of high planned housing development, the South Wales Valleys, which has been faced with, I think it's fair to say, kind of unjust and unmanaged and badly managed transitions in the past, as well as being home to carbon-intensive industry, and Tees Valley in County Durham, which is obviously a key area of focus for the current government in terms of net zero. Now, each area we spoke to, we asked them, what does a fair transition look like to you? And each area had their own answer, but there were some common themes which we drew out and produced into the final report, which was delivered in July of this year. So I'm just going to run through those key themes and shifts that we've argued the things that need to change in our approach to addressing the climate crisis and the way in which we restore nature. The first thing, and I think this was one of the most surprising things, was that actually people wanted to move from just talking about climate change as a problem to be mitigated to an opportunity to be seized. And I think this very much fits in with the Prime Minister's boosterism, as it were, a real focus on the opportunities, the job creation, the lower energy bills, the healthier lives that people can live as a result of action to deliver net zero and restore nature. And that leads to the first part of a new social contract, which we set out in the report, called the People's Dividend. The idea that actually whatever policies we're delivering on climate and nature, they shouldn't just be looking to deliver reductions in emissions and protecting nature, they should also be focusing on creating those opportunities and those benefits. What environmentalists, include myself in this, call the co-benefits of climate action, to many people are just the benefits. It's the jobs, it's the lower energy bills, and there should be much greater focus, both in policy and in narrative terms, on those things. Secondly, the idea that we need to move from fairness as an afterthought to fairness as a foundation. We heard time and time again, people thought and felt that climate policy, I mean a lot of policies in general actually, but climate and nature policy needed to be both fair and seen to be fair as well. And too often they felt like these policies were designed, introduced, and fairness was thought about as an afterthought. And actually you're seeing this debate play out now within the Conservative Party, and I think it's the right debate to be having. I don't necessarily agree with all the motives for why some people might be putting forward the questions around affordability, around the climate crisis, but it's absolutely right to be having that debate. If we do not address the distributional impacts of the transition and who pays, both across generations, and protect those on the lowest incomes, then we will lose public support. As our chairs, particularly Hilary Benn, would always say, the public have a veto on net zero, and this is something that we need to take seriously. Thirdly, the idea that we need to move from a transition that is done to people to one that is done with and by them. I think, to coin a phrase, people wanted control. They wanted to take back control. They wanted to be involved in this transition. They want to have a say, whether that's as consumers of businesses. They want more information, but they also wanted new ways of being involved, including things like citizens' juries, participatory budgeting at a local level. We need to involve people properly in the transition. Fourthly, to move from an approach where it's too individualised, government departments sit in silos, government sits in silos from business and civil society. We need to move to a whole economy and all society approach. What does that mean? Well, I know we heard from the Chancellor earlier about the immorality of spending, of borrowing what you can't afford. Now, whether you agree with that or not, I think there is an element of truth in that, in around spending public money on things that damage our climate and damage our environment and do a disservice to future generations. So one of the things we recommend in the report is the idea of the net zero and nature test. Every pound of public money should be tested, not just for value for money, but the idea as to whether it is contributing to the creation of emissions and damaging our environment. But the second half of that is the idea that were people really positive about the role of business in tackling this challenge. They wanted to see those businesses that were doing the right things and were clear about wanting to tackle net zero. They wanted them to be supported and provided with incentives. But on the flip side, for those that weren't doing enough, they also wanted to see penalties for the laggards. Fifthly, to move from top-down policy making to national leadership and local ownership and delivery. And I think this is really key where the levelling up agenda comes in. People want to see more power devolved across the country, power and resources. You can't level up from Whitehall. While we didn't hear that from in that phrase, that's what people told us. They want to see more decisions taken closer to home, including on climate. And finally, we need, I think, we heard really strongly, and this is one of the most striking things, is the idea that we need to move from climate alone to climate and nature together. The attachment that people have to nature is really not represented in our national discourse. I think it's partly to do with lockdown and people really valued their green spaces, but it's also the fact that they can see and feel nature, trees, their local green spaces in a way in which they don't necessarily see emissions. So we do need to put nature on the same footing in climate in our national policy, and we call for things like the National Nature Service, the public money for public good, doubling down on that in government in the ELM scheme, and a thing like such as the National Nature Recovery Committee, similar to the Committee on Climate Change as well. So those were some of the key findings. The report is 70,000 words. There's a 10,000 word summary or a much shorter digital summary, so do go away and read it, but that's just a quick summary of the report from me.
Thank you very much, Luke. I'm going to turn now to Laura for your perspective as co-chair of the Commission.
Well, first of all, I would just want to say a huge thank you to IPPR. It was a 2.5-year process, and we started off with Ed Miliband as one of our co-chairs, and then he got promoted, so we had the great pleasure of working with Hilary Benn. And the team at IPPR really coordinated a very, very large project. I mean... Luke has stolen all the great lines. I mean, what can one now do? But I think I'm going to reiterate a couple of them, maybe in my own words, and that is that, as he rightly said, citizens do have a veto on net zero, and that fairness absolutely has to be at the heart of it. But this aspect of decarbonisation being an opportunity, it is a huge opportunity, and we can see that in economic terms, but also in social and health terms. There is a very big hump that we have to get through, and the hump has all sorts of different dimensions. And it was our intention as chairs and the team that we needed to understand actually how do we deliver climate change policies from the extremes. And the extremes, as Luke mentioned, the extremes is from the oil and gas workers in Aberdeen. How do we help them? How do we help the workers in South Wales? And in South Wales, they have very, very bad local transport, for example. In Thurrock and also in Tees Valley, very dependent on chemicals. If we design our policies from those who are most extremely impacted by those policies, we designed the bridges that allow those people who had absolute ambition to decarbonise. We talked to people who'd never really thought about climate change before. These were not usual suspects. And they came absolutely with some very negative views about green people and campaigning, and actually co-created the bridges that they require to get from one place to another. Now, it's been going across parties, but let's look, we do not and must not create the same problems that we did when we started to close the coal mines. We cannot have blighted communities, and we absolutely have to take them forward. So we are moving in climate policy from what I would call the very big stuff, which is all that fab, offshore wind, huge investment, tons of money going into this big stuff, to what I would say is where the rubber hits the road, and that is when we start to actually impact individuals, small companies, jobs, etc. And that's why this framing is very important. There are sort of 3 key things that I would like us to take away, possibly from the point of view of policy and conservative policy, and that is the people's dividend. As I say, there is a people's dividend: zero marginal cost energy, cheaper mobility, more efficiency and less pollution, and warmer homes. But none of that is monetized. Everything is looked at as an expenditure rather than an investment. And that investment period is because we look at it just in time, rather than if we looked at it as like an investment in the roads programme, which is a 30-year investment. We also are not treating individuals, which we will have to spend money on decarbonising our homes, in the same way that we treat business. So Ørsted gets a 15-year contract for an offshore wind farm, right? I have to pay to retrofit my house absolutely just in time. So why are we not looking at mechanisms that can be decentralised and miniaturised? The mechanisms exist, and so we start to need to actually democratise these support mechanisms that exist right across the thing. And the last point, which is absolutely crucial, and what Luke picked up, and I think probably a lot of Conservatives would agree with this, we have got to understand location, location, location. It's all about, in many ways, designing with national leadership, but designing localised toolkits that actually allow somewhere like Tees Valley looks totally different from somewhere like Wiltshire. It needs a different set of tools. It needs a different set of levers. And so I think for many reasons, one really needs to look at the power structures that we have across national and local government and the financial structures, and start to enable localities and people to co-design their climate change journey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. We'll turn now to Bernard.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for this opportunity to comment on this extremely interesting report, which is full of splendid ideas and thoughts and ways of working and ways of engagement. But I hope you'll forgive me if I make some critique of it. I agree with some of the recommendations, but not with others. And I think the idea of a just transition is an absolutely indispensable one. But I think the transition as proposed would cause energy prices to rise, and the state would have to support those hardest hit. And the idea of revenue from carbon pricing paid out as a carbon dividend is interesting. In fact, Greg Mankiw, chair of the Council of Economic Advisers under George Bush, has written op-eds along similar lines. So I think there's quite a confluence of thinking on some of the ideas across the political divide. The broader approach of conducting citizen assemblies that end up recommending progressive policy solutions is a bit more problematic. I'm in favour of citizens' assemblies in principle, and there have been examples where they've been very successful. But it's very important that they don't get politicised or even subconsciously driven in one direction. Early on in the report, you talked about the Gilets jaunes protests and how delivering the transition in a fair way is crucial to securing legitimacy for enduring public and political support. I'm quoting from the report. And no doubt granting a tax cut for the richest while imposing a carbon tax that disproportionately impacts the poorest was bad politics for a centrist like Macron. But I think the way in which the report deals with the political trade-offs is actually quite Macron-esque. In response to the Gilets jaunes protest movement, Macron launched an initiative dubbed Le Grand Débat National. This involved Macron touring the country, meeting with representatives from different regions and professional sectors and organising as a citizens' assembly. The French government selected 150 members from a Citizens' Convention for Climate Citizens' Convention for Climate, representative of the French public across 6 demographic dimensions: gender, age, socio-economic background, education level, location type, and province. The convention made 149 recommendations. Macron initially implied that he would implement them wholesale, but in the end, he only accepted about 40%. Macron concluded, "They helped me at the start, and now they want everything," and that you can't say that just because 150 citizens wrote something, it's the Bible or the Quran, he said. Some climate groups, like Friends of the Earth, implied that Macron should have simply accepted all of the proposals. I think we should interrogate that approach, not just the president. Chris Bickerton is a left-wing political scientist, recently wrote a book called Techno-Populism. And he argues that while technocracy and populism are often framed as opposites in modern politics, they combine in interesting ways. The 5-Star Movement in Italy, Vote Leave's pioneering campaign in the UK, Macron in France. These examples suggest that existing political institutions have failed, and technocratic methods can foster a new form of politics. In government, however, they find it difficult to achieve the sweeping reforms that their popular mandates expect. Look at the protracted nature of the binary decision over Brexit, for example. Climate change is perhaps the defining problem of our age, but rather than calling on us to embrace direct democracy or forms of direct democracy, I would argue it should encourage us also to strengthen the existing institutions and openly discuss the trade-offs between incompatible goals. Grafting a citizens' assembly onto an already struggling system will not make government work more effectively, nor will it restore confidence in democracy and representative democracy in particular. And finally, if I can just end by mentioning that a couple of weeks ago I launched a video called, it was a presentation to something called the Hot Debate at the University of Essex. And it is about how we make climate change the central effort and why we have to do so of our government, how we've got to get the government to lead by example, how we've got to get government to engage the population so that the population will actually come with us on this journey and not resist it, how there is actually a cynicism amongst politicians. They have to keep the messages depressingly simple and the public can't really understand anything complicated. but also that most of the public are very cynical about politicians and government and have very little faith in what government promises to do or is capable of doing. And, you know, just think about what you feel about Boris's government at the moment on a lot of fronts. And there are plenty of Conservative MPs who sort of share these feelings of scepticism. But if you look at the one or two of the things that have happened recently, I think the pandemic is going to be have a transformative effect on government, because the pandemic created that dynamic centre of government which simply didn't exist outside a time of crisis. And if you look at the Cabinet Office, it's now got a data centre, it's now got a situation centre. Maybe, I mean, if I've got more time, can I just go through this?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, just think about the fuel crisis at the moment. And I would say lesson number one is the UK needs to develop more resilient supply chains for road fuels. I mean, it's unanswerable. I mean, yeah, why didn't we do it before? Everything that's happened was predicted and predictable. Lesson number two, the public will not be flannelled by sound bites and feeble assurances from ministers that everything's going to get better. And the success of COVID comms was that it was based on, one, on press conferences, number 10, involving not just politicians, but impartial experts and people with real knowledge, subject knowledge. Two, simple and understandable data in which the public could have confidence, expressed in tables and graphs which people could interrogate. Three, presentations by permanent and impartial Whitehall figures like the Chief Scientist and the CMO. And all of this was supported by clear and memorable guidance to the public. All crises should be treated in this way. But it does depend on the government, first of all, being prepared for that crisis, because it took a while for the COVID thing to get going. And also, it relies on the government admitting there is a crisis. And very often the government doesn't want to admit there's a crisis. And lesson number three, if there is a known persistent problem, like shortage of HGV drivers, someone should be accountable for addressing it. Sooner or later, it lands on the government anyway. Ministers should have been holding industry accountable for addressing the skills shortage, not just passing the buck to industry in the hope that it was in their own interest to sort it out. That approach has obviously failed in the fuel crisis. Lesson number four. There should be a permanent unit in the Cabinet Office, probably under the National Security Council, that is constantly scanning and exploring possibilities that might happen, things that, how to deal with things that can't be foreseen, and interrogating government departments about how well prepared for them they are, making sure that departments aren't expecting another department to do that job. HGV licenses are case in point. Was it a BAE's responsibility, or was it a transport responsibility, or was it DVLC's responsibility? Whose responsibility was it? And my phone's just lost the plot. And but it involves new skills being brought into government, strategic thinking skills. It involves engaging external experts and valuing subject knowledge and expertise, something not which the civil service doesn't do so well as it used to. And it involves legitimising challenge and questioning of accepted truths, something that politicians find very hard to expect when a civil servant comes to them with something that's not the line to take. And to make all this work, the government's got to want to have this strategic thinking. Otherwise, they'll just keep shooting the messenger. But I think when we're thinking about any path towards more radical action, and climate change certainly demands that, we actually need to change in the culture of government. And just coming up with, I mean, the citizens' assemblies have got a role. They will come up with policies that may or may not have merit, but they've got to engage the system. And if the system can't be engaged, well, as Macron proved, what you want won't happen.
Great, thank you very much, Bernard. And I think I'd really like in the discussion to get on to that question of citizens'
And you can see my video if you Google Bernard Jenkin YouTube hot debate.
And we can have it on the big screen in the end.
Do, yes, please. That'd be great. I'd really like that.
But we'll hope to get on to that question of citizens' assemblies and how they sit in a representative democracy. Before we do, I'm going to turn to Isabella.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I have followed the Commission from its inception through to interim reports on the final one, and it's just been the most extraordinary process, and you've all worked so hard. It's very, very impressive, so well done. I'd like to talk a little bit about nature now and the sort of aspects of that in the report, and to give a bit of an overview as to where I think we are on this, because it's a hugely important aspect of the entire environment, and obviously there's a lot of focus around climate and net zero, but I think a lot of that's to do with COP, which is obviously only a month away, which seems mad, considering how long that has been planned for. So I think where is nature right now, and is it being considered as serious as the climate crisis? And I would say yes and no. No, in the sense that everybody is focusing on COP26, and we've got COP15 next year, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's the Paris Agreement for nature. It's sort of COP26's little sister that's sort of been left behind and delayed again for quite some time. So I think that sort of happened simply because the UK government is obviously focusing so much on what it wants to achieve at COP26 and net zero, and all of the big developments where we are waiting for from the UK government are very net zero focused. We're waiting for the heat and building strategy. We're waiting for the net zero review. We're waiting for the net zero strategy. We can kind of just go on and on and on, and we don't really have any big nature ones coming up, and that's something to be raised, and it should be seen with quite a lot of concern. We have things to be thankful for. Zach Goldsmith, he is doing a really good job. Bias, yes, I used to work for him. But really, we are lucky that he is in a role where he's fighting really hard, and we've got some other really brilliant ministers and advisors and others that are pushing this incredibly hard. The entire environment sector, through everything they had trying to get nature targets set into law, we are now going to have those. That's a massive win. 30 by 30, that's extraordinarily amazing in terms of land and sea. This is what the UK government has now committed to. That's a global protection of 30% of land and sea by 2030, and this is a really big leadership role ahead of both COPs. What else have we got? New woodlands are now going to be grown along riverbanks, and the Blue Belt, which is amazing, in international marine reserves. So we have a lot of stuff to be thankful for, and I think that the nature targets 30 by 30 is a really great framework, but we've got a lot to do nationally to try and sort this out, and I don't think that focusing everything on the heat and building strategy is going to divert the serious issues that we have with our nature and mainly our rivers here in the UK. I mean, it's quite extraordinarily shameful. Every river is polluted beyond legal limits. UK water ranked last in Europe for bathing water in 2020. France has 570 rivers safe for bathing. We have one. 60% of freshwater species are in decline. 10% are going extinct. And untreated human waste went into UK rivers 400,000 times in 2020 alone. So I think if we want to look at where we are in the state of UK nature, that alone says a lot. And it is such an easy win that we could transform, and a lot of people are campaigning for this in the spending review and are calling on the Chancellor to put some serious investment in enforcing river pollution to make sure that this does not happen again. I mean, it is truly shameful. Next is the rest of UK waters and fishing. A third of UK fish populations are in a healthy state. That's it. trawlers are hugely damaging, and some of our UK fish stocks and ecosystems are on the brink of collapse. It's quite scary. So we should ensure sustainable fishing in all UK waters and not set quotas in excess of scientific evidence. We must implement highly protected marine areas and ban bottom trawling in all marine protected areas. And thirdly, we must qualify and protect the climate value of the seabed. It is being trashed right now by trawlers and massive overfishing. And if you look at the carbon storage in the seabed, it is quite extraordinary. And if you turn it up, if you trawl it, it is just absolutely extraordinarily damaging. And you can try and retrofit the UK housing stock, but you can also look at nature and what we are doing. So those are sort of two things I would say. I also want to just go on to Bernard's point about crises, because I'm a lobbyist. I work for lots of different environmental groups and also corporates, and I have a number of Tory MPs say, "Oh, please don't use the word emergency." That's very lefty. So I would really welcome working with you, Bernard, on this, because I completely agree. We should start having more emergency meetings and actually talking about the state of what is actually happening. So, we should chat.
Great. Well, I'm glad that we've got that commitment in the first half hour. So, last but not least, on to Sam.
Great, thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak today, and well done to the IPPR team on a really great report. Well done Luke, well done Laura for co-chairing it. It's a really excellent piece of work, and it's great to be able to speak about it today. So I was going to provide a few reflections on the report, and then I was encouraged to provide some comments on some of the announcements that Labour made at their conference last week, and also looking ahead to this kind of environment policy landscape post COP26 and how we maintain momentum. So to start on the report itself, so a couple of things that I really liked about it. Firstly, the optimism. As you said, Luke, there's a real kind of Johnsonian boosterism running throughout the report, whether it's the millions of good-paying jobs across the country, the revitalisation of industrial heartlands, whether it's the more abundant nature and green spaces that are good for people's health, or the healthier cities with cleaner air and opportunities for active travel. I think you really made the case very positively for why this transition brings lots of benefits, and particularly at the moment where we're having lots of conversations about the upfront costs of the transition and the investment required to switch over to cleaner energy. I think that optimism is a really important contribution to the debate. I think the other side of the ledger as well is the cost savings that come from net zero. The Committee on Climate Change are clear that particularly from the transition from combustion engine vehicles to electric vehicles, there will be big savings from the switch to more efficient electric engines. And I think that again is something that those of us that want to make the political case for net zero and why this is important, we need to be optimistic and positive about the benefits and not seed the ground that this is a burden that we should manage. Secondly, I wanted to pick up on the fairness focus. I think the just transition is often seen as a kind of labour movement left-wing conversation, and I really don't think it should be, and I don't think it is the case. I think lots of the arguments you make about fairness are present in different words and different language in debates that Conservatives have on these issues. And I think there's no doubt that it's the case that without certain policy interventions, certain unfairnesses will arise as a result of net zero, whether it's vehicle running costs being more expensive for people that don't have private driveways to be able to charge their car off their own mains electricity supply, or people that can't afford the upfront costs of insulating their home in order to get cheaper energy bills. I think, look across the piece, there are a whole range of potential unfairnesses which we need to proactively try and resolve. It's not something we should accept as inevitable. It's something we need to have a laser-like focus on in terms of government policy to make sure that particularly lowest income, but not exclusively, I think people on middle income as well are supported to make these changes and adopt these new clean technologies. And if I could do a brief plug for some polling that Sen commissioned via Opinion, which we launched at the weekend. looking at particularly this issue of how keen and supportive people are of switching to clean technologies like heat pumps and electric cars. Generally, the support is very high among people, but you see the support fall if people think that their personal finances are going to be harmed. And I think that is a lesson for policymakers, that as we look to maintain political support for this transition, we think quite clear-headedly about that fairness question. A couple of bits where, again, I'm a little bit more sceptical, and I know we've talked about these before with the IPPR team, but I would echo some of Bernard's scepticism about citizens' assemblies. I think there's no doubt that we're going to fail to get to net zero without much better public engagement on this transition and what it means, and bringing people with us and having that conversation. I'm just not convinced that a small group of individuals, of citizens, being given an amount of information which we're never going to be able to give the rest of the populace, and asking them to decide what they would do in that situation, whether that is a route to sort of securing democratic legitimacy. I'm not sure that the voter that wasn't involved in that process, in that jury or assembly, would necessarily buy into the conclusions that they draw. So I think we need to, Citizens Assembly have a role, but I think we need to look much harder at how we do public engagement on net zero. I don't think it's the end of the conversation. The other point you'd expect me to make is I'd like to see an even greater role for private enterprise and markets within the transition. I do, and this I think will lead into my kind of first comment on where I thought the Labour Party announcements last week slightly fell down for me. You look at the private sector and net zero, and it is obviously a huge driver of innovation, of cost reductions, of investment, of job creation. We need to support the private sector to the hilt to play the fullest possible role in this transition. You can see this in the power sector. Often you hear the argument that we need the state to intervene massively in order to get the speed of transition that we need to achieve in order to meet our climate targets, but I'm not sure that's the case. If you look at the power sector, for example, it is fundamentally market mechanisms that have driven that rapid driving off of coal from the system, from over 40% of our grid in the early 2010s now down to almost zero. Renewables ramped up from again a few percent to now over a third of our electricity generation. That's been done through carbon pricing, through competitive clean energy markets. So I think once the private sector has those frameworks, you can really see change happen very quickly. So I don't think we need to assume that the sort of state equals sort of speed, that actually the really quick change and the really quick scale in particular, I think, comes from getting the private sector behind very quickly. So I think, particularly on the Labour package last week, I saw that one of the areas Rachel Rees highlighted for investment was offshore wind, which I think minimal public spending is needed for that. Potentially some money to upgrade ports, to help co-invest in some of the factories of the supply chain, because we want the jobs as well as the cheap power from offshore wind. But nonetheless, I think primarily we should not be looking to the state to drive the transition in the power sector. I think in terms of how the Conservative government should respond, I think they need to make the case clearly for that private investment, that highlight the risks of crowding out private finance. And come forward with market mechanisms. We've seen them work really well in the power sector, but in heat in particular, there's a gap there. Nature and land use, which Izzy's talked very well about today. I think the environmental land management scheme potentially could be that market mechanism, which would drive a lot more investment in more sustainable land use. But again, we need to see the actual policy come through from government. Finally, probably over time, but yeah, final point was around the political momentum around this agenda beyond COP26, and this sense that it might kind of fizzle out almost, that attention might pass once we're past Glasgow. I just don't see that happening. Obviously, the public are deeply concerned about climate change. And all the polling shows that that's only going in one direction. Again, the polling that we did showed that 70% of people are more worried about climate change than they were a decade ago. And I think as you see the impacts of climate change materialise around the world, flooding and heat waves and so on, those things become more frequent and more extreme. Those concern levels are only going to rise. And I think the pressure on politicians to act and to respond and meet that concern is only going to get greater. I also think at the same time, the economics of this transition are getting easier. The costs are falling of various clean technologies, heat pumps, green hydrogen, carbon capture. And that, let's be honest, that is going to make these choices easier for politicians to make. As the technology come down, the sort of the dichotomy between rising energy bills or curtailing economic growth and environmental progress is collapsing. I mean, I think it already has collapsed quite definitively, but the last attempts to make that argument, I think, will look increasingly ridiculous in that context. Final point. I think this net zero transition is going to take many years to get right. There's lots of detailed policy to get right, and we've just made a start on it with all the various strategies the government's published this year. We've got the carbon budgets that are going to keep pressure on ministers, the Committee on Climate Change to make sure that they're meeting those targets, and the OEP to take them to court potentially if they miss those targets. So I think the idea that politicians will be able to ignore this issue once the circus of Glasgow moves on, I don't buy. So I'm optimistic that this agenda will stay at the forefront of the political discussion in the UK. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So I think before I come to questions, and I am going to come to them, so please do prepare your questions. I think we should pick up this point about citizens' assemblies, and in particular how we should think about decision making and involving people in decisions around net zero in nature. Luke, do you want to start by saying a bit about the role of citizens' assemblies in our commission?
Yeah, thank you. I think the thing that was different about the work was that we did bring together kind of policy experts, policy makers and citizens' juries. And I mean, actually on the point around, and obviously we drew them from across the country, and actually the final report was informed by them, but not kind of wedded to everything that was recommended in each report, not least because each one was focused on individual areas. But on the point that Sam and Bernard made, actually, I'm not sure that I would disagree with anything you said. They have a role. I would be the first to say they are no replacement for representative democracy. I mean, it's kind of this is a personal view, but it would take about 10 minutes for them to be delegitimized if they were taken as Bible by government, because I think people would say, well, who are them? Who elected them? How do I remove them? I completely agree. However, I do think that they play an important role in making a contribution to the debate, in understanding how people view those trade-offs once provided with the information. I think, and then on to my second point on it, I think actually the jurors fundamentally agreed with you, Bernard and Sam, that they argued, I think it was our jurors in Thurrock, argued for a COVID-style communications plan around the climate crisis. They want to see other people get the information that they heard in these juries. They want advice points on their high streets. They want they want sites on the internet. They want to be provided by information by businesses, by the energy companies of which they are consumers, and from government as well. And then thirdly, again, I think they would agree with you, Bernard, on the idea around experts around the table. Our jurors in Aberdeenshire, I was trying to look for the quote, but my phone has failed me, argued for an expert-style commission within government, drawn from all across disciplines, again, similarly learning from COVID, I think, because they have valued that expertise and they want to see that in the steer the government's response to the climate crisis. And I guess just finally, I think I would agree with you around risk. We've done a lot of work on risk and climate at IPPR. The defence industry and the security industry in both the United States and the UK have recognised climate risk far longer than most others, because they recognise the fundamental threat it poses to our national security and defence. And I think those voices should be heard a lot more, because they are looking at longer tail threats down the line that perhaps more short-term politics doesn't often get. So actually, I think a lot of the juries and what they said you'd find a lot of agreement in their recommendations and the findings that we had from the juries.
I love when disagreement becomes agreement. Laura, do you want to?
No, absolutely. I mean, I have a funny feeling that actually the juries that we had were a little bit different from the juries that, let's say, Macron had. They're very localised. I think this issue about local texture is really, we cannot stress enough that even in one local authority, you will have a port, you'll have a village, and you'll have a market town with a little bit of industry on it. These actually require very textured, different approaches. And so actually it's about, and I know Bernard does this. I certainly, when I was an MP, did this. I learnt so much from my constituents. I really, really fundamentally did. It's like you understand the plumbing of every single area, and it's a very different texture. And all I'm saying, so I don't believe that we need that sort of Macron national scale consistently, but we must be informed by people, because it is only with them actually that we end up with their approval to move things ahead. On the so-called consumer side, there's something that Northern Ireland is about to publish, which is very, very exciting, their strategy. And they are looking to set up in every local authority, in every major town, not just city, but every town, a one-stop consumer shop. And what that's going to do, it's going to coordinate all the crazy sort of plethora of different support mechanisms. It's going to provide key advice. It's going to help people make certain choices. It's going to give them options of new heating mechanisms with all the advice and all the accredited sort of tradesmen that go with that advice. And I think that is an absolute front of centre approach by which you can actually help the consumer navigate. And we had a similar sort of proposal in the report. My very last point about risk is actually this is, I totally agree with Isabel, this is an emergency. Time is super running out. But what we don't really do is ever classify this as a massive health and safety issue. I mean, how many people are really happy putting their kids in the car without putting seatbelts on? I mean, you know, this is absolutely a fundamental. We know where this is going. We don't need to, you know, fabricate it. We absolutely know where this is going. And that it's not actually, that we don't consider it, as we consider it as a nice option rather than an absolute essential piece of health and safety legislation and action.
Great, thank you. I think I'll take questions from the floor if there are some. Can I see if anyone has questions? I don't believe you. One at the front here.
I'd like to ask a question. I've got two questions really. One is, two questions really. One is whether, just arising from your discussion about the COVID press conferences and so on, Bernard, and perhaps all of you, is there a way that we could have a sort of monthly or 3-monthly presentation of data of some kind that we would all accept, shows whether we are or are not making progress on the targets that we need to make progress on? I don't know whether that's something that could be developed and worked on. And secondly, I wanted to ask really whether we think that, it's a difficult question for maybe everybody here to answer, but do we think that the government, as it currently constituted, actually has a capacity to push this forward at the pace that I know everybody here thinks it needs to be pushed at? Is it organised enough to do it? Does it have enough strategy? Or is it capable of making a strategy that will get us there? Because as you've said, there are a whole lot of things that haven't been published that should have been published already, and every month that slips by is another month of wasted opportunity.
You were first, I think.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. I had a question on the cost of net zero and what the right way to frame that is, because while it's important to emphasize the benefits and that it can be a win-win to tackle climate change, there is of course a fiscal cost to, in the short term, to make it just, so compensate the losers in certain regions or certain types of households that will lose out. There will be a fiscal cost. So what's the right way of highlighting the opportunities of net zero, but also saying we actually need some investment into those communities and for those affected people?
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, sort of related. It's a really simple question, but probably quite tricky. Who pays for a fair transition? Because somebody has to. I don't buy the market are going to just deliver offshore wind like that. I mean, who pays, really? It's easy to say it, but someone's got to pay.
Great. So we have two questions on cost. One on how to talk about that cost in a way that is honest, I guess, and kind of gets people thinking about the benefits as well as the kind of upfront costs. One, on who pays, and then a question about government capacity and whether there are innovations we could do, such as presentation of data. Isabella, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I really like your idea in terms of us doing some more press conferences. Something that's just sprung to mind. Every summer, the Climate Change Committee puts out their report on how the government is actually doing. So why don't we get Chris Stark to come into number 10, and he can present like Chris Whitty. Next slide, please. And have the PM up there, sort of like shrinking a little bit, going, oh God, as he basically goes through it. Why not? Bernard, what do you think?
Well, I might as well tell you, I wrote to the government last week suggesting, not particularly Chris Stark, but suggesting exactly that this was a monthly. It goes with something, though. It goes with deciding what are the metrics by which we measure the success of government policy. And the government's going to have to get its act together on that. I mean, you talk about nature. The biodiversity targets were set in the Paris COP, if I'm correct. It was one of the four major goals of Paris was to secure biodiversity. So we should have a species count and across different parts of the plant and animal and other kingdoms. And we should have a monthly press conference about how we're doing on biodiversity. And, I mean, the trends are rather long term. It's not going to be as exciting as COVID. We can't have one every day. But if we want to engage people, I mean, listening to you, Isabella, I mean, who could not be, frankly, moved by what you're telling us? Yeah. How we have completely trashed our environment, our nature. And not feel threatened by it. And if the public really understood what we have done to our country and to our planet and to our seas, and that we've got to do something about it so that our children and grandchildren actually have a chance to survive, I mean, they get very angry indeed. They get very passionate. And some people are very angry and don't feel that the rest of the population is nearly passionate and angry enough, and we've got and yet those protests, I'm afraid the protests that block the M25 are very unpopular because people will blame them for the fuel shortages and the fuel crisis, and quite rightly so, partly to blame. But what Winston Churchill did during the war, and we must always be very careful of wartime analogies, he didn't promise that there would be a Second World War dividend to the British people. He said, I can offer you nothing except blood, sweat, blood, toil, tears and sweat. But he mobilised the British people. And I think we've got to look upon this as mobilising the British people behind a much more radical agenda, which if it's explained to them, they will accept. And this is what my video says, by the way. But you know, if we patronise them with little bits of sound bites and saying, well, what they really want is tax cuts all the time, whatever the circumstances, they don't. And I just think we're on the cusp of something really big here. But has the government got the capacity to do this? I don't think the government even. I don't think that. I mean, this is where I think we tend to sort of blame. You know, the traditional political thing is get the Secretary of State in front of them, get the Prime Minister in front of the Select Committee, and tell them you're responsible. It's happened on your watch. I mean, this is a hopeless approach because if ministers had the advice and the system was presenting the policies and options that they really need to be offered, then we wouldn't have these problems. They can't expect to have 360 vision on every subject and the civil service sitting there passively will tell us what you'd like to do. But the system's got rather like that. It's got very generalist in character, and the civil service career structure really doesn't favour subject knowledge and expertise in depth in the way that it used to.
Can I add in a little bit of optimism?
Well, yes, please. But I was going to say something about hopelessness and hope. There's a wonderful piece I read on. There's a website called Psyche, which is well worth a visit, and it publishes psychological research and papers and psychiatric research. Well, one of the bits was how they've if you create a sense of helplessness in a population, or even amongst animals, and they've done experiments with dogs and electrodes and things, you become psychologically listless, you become uncooperative, you become lethargic, you become uncreative. If you create hope, you create dynamism, teamwork, creativity. So actually we've got to infuse the whole climate agenda with hope and optimism, because otherwise we're not going to get the people there. We're not going to be able to lead. We've got to convince people we can win the campaign.
Yeah. So just to sort of end on some optimism, we have been waiting for all of these strategies around heat and building, and maybe they'll be amazing. Maybe the net zero strategy will be fantastic. And also, if the front page of the Times is correct that we're going to do electrification by 2035, that is amazing. That's us going towards our 6th carbon budget, which is fantastic. And, you know, maybe COP will be great. Maybe Convention on Biological Diversity will set a global movement towards saving nature. And the things that I said about rivers and the seas, well, the current Secretary of State and all of the ministers are very, very aware of this, and you know, people are fighting very, very hard to try and get this changed. So I do think that we should be optimistic, and I think that the idea about doing these press conferences, yes, they were sort of a scary daily update, but you would want them to be something that the PM, when he's really excited and comes out, he's like, great, that's what you want it to be up there with Chris Stark, being like, yes, Chris, and I've done that, tick, so that's kind of, you need to add a little bit to that as well, otherwise it will become seriously depressing. Yeah. And I'm really sorry I've not answered any of the other questions.
I'm pleased to hear the optimism though. Sam?
I wanted to briefly touch on the emergency conferences and then pick up on the two cost of net zero and paying. So on the conferences point, I think that sounds like a very good idea. I think it can't just end there though. I think, and it's not just a question of government as well. I think this. So one voice I think it would be great to have more on this is NGOs. So NGOs at the moment spend a lot of time, in my view, sort of campaigning on particular policies that they want government to adopt. And I think they could do more campaigning directed at the public to highlight, for example, gas boilers contribute to climate change. So Greenpeace actually recently launched a great campaign on gas boilers, but I think that's the kind of first one that I've actually seen from an NGO, and this is kind of the policymakers desperately need that awareness in the public that gas boilers contribute to climate change, and polling will tell you that actually a lot of people don't realise that. So, if you're then asking them to replace their gas boiler with a more expensive heat pump when it breaks down, and they don't actually understand why, you've got a big problem. And if the NGOs aren't helping you with that, making that case and being out in front of government as they need to be. So I think, there's a role for NGOs, there's a role for businesses as well, providing information about the sustainability of goods through labelling. I was at a Google event recently, and they're working with lots of cool data people that, again, hopefully can get lots of this information to people, to consumers at the point of consumption, so that they're, again, aware of the environmental impacts of what they're doing, and it just becomes a more present thing in people's mind. So I think we need all of these tools to try and engage people. I don't think it is just a question of government messaging, although I think that is important too. On the cost of net zero, I think the questioner kind of almost answered his own question in terms of how you frame it. I think there are several aspects to it. There's the cost of inaction. We can't just look at the costs of tackling climate change. We need to look at the costs of not doing so, the flooding and the heat waves and all the rest of it, not just overseas in developing countries, but here in the UK as well. Those costs are great and severe, and if we don't tackle this, they're going to get exponentially worse. The co-benefits we've already talked about. I do think we need an optimistic story about costs falling as well. So, there is a really great story to tell here. Look at the renewable sector with what's happened in offshore wind. Batteries have fallen in cost by 97% over 3 decades. There's a great story to tell there. So yes, some of these technologies are expensive now, but we've seen these incredible experience curves from technologies with a bit of pump priming of the market. The costs do come down, but absolutely be honest about the costs, and we're not saying this is an investment-free transition, but equally let's not seed the ground that this is some burden that we need to manage, because as Ben is saying, I don't think we will bring the public with us if it is this message of doom and gloom. And lastly, on the sort of who pays, it gives me a chance to slightly tweak one of my comments in my opening remarks, but I do think the Committee on Climate Change has commented on this in terms of who is going to finance the net zero transition. They say, I can't remember if it's the vast majority or the majority of it will be financed by the private sector, is their recommendation in their net zero report. So this is going to be predominantly financed by the private sector. These are investments that will create revenue streams for investors, which people will pay back through their energy bills, through their food bills, etc. I think if we can create those price signals, that investment will flow. There is a role for taxpayers, and I think looking ahead at the comprehensive spending review, hopefully this will be one of the priorities for additional spending in that, but definitely a role for priming some of these new technologies, grants for lower middle income households, and fingers crossed at the end of October there will be something in there, because I think that is really important, particularly for what we're talking about today in terms of a fair transition.
Brilliant, thank you. Laura?
No, I just want to pick up on the cost thing, and I absolutely agree with Sam, is firstly we need some pump priming and some innovation money to actually drop the overall price of this. But secondly, as I said, why do we treat individuals differently from how we treat businesses in terms of, if one's looking at this, you don't go out and buy your car. On the whole, most people lease a car. You do it on finance. The point is ensuring that transition point is actually at a price point that we can all afford, and that's about calculating it over a 10, 12-year period and creating financial services products that this country is actually not very bad at. I mean, we're very good at it. So we can do this. The problem is that we haven't got the business models in place. There isn't, in some ways, the mechanisms by which we can normalise this, whether it be a heat pump, whether it be a retrofit or whatever. And we should learn both from the housing market, the mortgage market, and also the leasing sector, where we should actually be able to drive this down to a very, very manageable level. But just don't ask me to spend 20 grand, which is what it would cost my house to be retrofitted in one go. And it's not low-income workers. It is absolutely, it's probably 80% of the population that's not sitting on 20 grand ready to do this.
Thank you. And Luke, do you want to come in on these?
Thanks. I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think one of at the recent summit, Boris Johnson said, citing Kermit the Frog, that it's easy being green, and I think actually it's the opposite at the moment. It's not easy enough to be green, and that's the thing we heard from the citizens, and indeed that we hear from businesses that we work with as well, that at the moment it's too hard to, the green choice is not the easy choice, and a lot of that, some of it comes down to information, but a lot of it does come down to affordability. I think where I would disagree is I think there is a greater role for public investment, even than what the CCC sets out, not least because of the return in terms of job creation and the multiplier effect across the economy. But even on the bar that the CCC has set, the government is currently not meeting it. I was slightly dismayed, I guess, by the speech by the Chancellor today. It was kind of very little mention of climate investment, and I hope that means, on the hopeful side, I hope that means that he's holding it back for the CSR. But I agree with what's been said. Actually, the idea of an able-to-pay market in housing, in particular, is a bit of a misnomer. Very few people have those kind of savings lying around. And the government has a big role to play in supporting those on the lowest incomes. And I think I would agree, as the decade goes on, as costs fall, as the private sector innovates, you will see more private market products, mortgage products, etc. If you reform the energy market, ways in which people can pay back through their energy bills. But I would argue that there's a much bigger role for the state and public investment, certainly in the short to medium term, both in terms of investment, but also regulation and certainty as well.
Just challenge that, because the government is not a bottomless pit, and we're not going to be able to fund everything from government. But the regulation is a form of indirect taxation. For example, if we decided that there were going to be no new homes built unless they were net zero homes. It would undoubtedly increase the cost of those homes. But it would make those homes much cheaper to run. Who pays for the net zero policy? We all do. It's completely unavoidable. Money, in the end, all taxes fall on consumers and voters. Unavoidable. But what if we built net zero homes now? They would be, in the longer run, cheaper for the consumer. They'd be cheaper because their bills would be much lower, and they'd be cheaper because they wouldn't have to be retrofitted to be net zero homes at a later date. So why aren't we doing that? Well, we're being lobbied by the house builders, aren't we? And they're saying we can't build the houses.
And actually, if you designed everything around a net zero standard, it actually would reduce the cost very, very quickly as well. It's
but
only
also, it does create other problems. There's a shortage of the kind of materials and,
Yeah.
the skills necessary to build net zero homes, passive house homes. But all this needs to, and I wait with bated breath for this white paper, but if it's anything like the energy white paper, I mean, the energy white paper was very thick and glossy, had lots and lots of words and pictures, but really it didn't add up to very much. I mean, okay, if the government's going to spend something, why doesn't it order 60 small modular nuclear power stations to pump prime Rolls-Royce to produce at scale SMRs? Because that, unless we get that, we're not going to hit the net zero target. And yet the government's saying, well, the market's got to solve that problem. That's the case where I think we could have more intervention. That would be an investment. But I mean, we're going to have a much more active state, but it can't always be the government just paying for everything. Can't.
Having made us optimistic, you've now made me pessimistic.
Well, I think there's a mood. Boris is not averse to expanding the role of the state, but I think we've got to do it intelligently. We can't just pay for everything.
Can I ask you, Bernard, and Sam and Isabel, there are lots of strategies. What I don't have is plan. Do you know what I mean? There's lots of destinations, but there isn't
lots of targets, but they don't.
But
I mean, what the
there
government does
isn't
is it
something
announces
tomorrow.
policy,
Yes.
and it's very thin on implementation.
Exactly.
Do you
the
know
plan.
in the integrated review, there's 2 pages on implementation out of 120 pages. I mean, this is part of the disease we've got in government, that strategy is about ends, ways and means, about defining our ends and defining the ways of achieving our ends within the means available.
Yes.
And we don't do strategy. We do lots of plans that are
They're
undeliverable.
called strategy anyway.
Isabella.
But that's exactly the same when it comes to fishing and rivers. We don't need to change any of the regulation
No.
around rivers.
No.
It's all there. It's all
To
what we
do
need.
with-
Nothing's enforced. And it's the same thing with our UK marine protected areas. You have the Secretary of State stand up and it's so fantastic, we've got all these marine protected areas. But they then asked Richard Benyon to do this amazing review. And he said, I'm sorry guys, these are paper parks. They are in name only. Nothing's happened. And Greenpeace have done this amazing campaign over the summer. I'm biased, but they got MPs onto boats, taking them to MPAs in their patches to see them being trawled. And they were like, this is what we are talking about. And it's so eye-opening. And they sat there going, what? How is this happening? And it's like, exactly. Nothing's being enforced. So, yeah, we really need to sort it out.
Thanks very much, everyone. Are there any final questions before I ask my final question?
I've got a final question.
Go on.
I've just looked at the Greenpeace stuff. Greenpeace isn't here, is it? I'd love to ask Doug Parr this question. I mean, what faith have we got that retrofitting heat pumps to our kind of housing stock is actually going to be effective? Because my understanding is heat pumps cannot heat water sufficiently to go through the radiators that you've got in your house that are adapted for a gas boiler to sufficient temperature to heat your house. So your heat pump's going to be going, like the clappers, to keep your house warm, and your house will never get warm. Does anybody know about this?
Your different sort of radiator system.
I know a little bit about this. So I think actually for most houses it is fine, but especially for like industrial heating, so for perhaps like in a hospital or where you need like very, very hot water, then they can't be used. So I think, yes, they can be rolled out in residential areas, but for industrial sites,
I am
you need
sceptical
more.
about that.
Okay,
Because
well,
your
I'm
central
not.
heating hot water generally is between 40 and 50 degrees. your heat pump will not heat the water to that level.
Luke, do you
I'm
want
no
to-
expert.
Sam.
I was just going to briefly come in. I mean, I think there's definitely no doubt that there are a number of practical challenges with heat pumps as the technology currently stands. We need to ramp it up this decade, because I don't think there's any other route to decarbonising heating in this decade than heat pumps. There's hydrogen potentially as a solution, but we're not going to be able to deploy that for quite a while. The government's still doing quite small trials because a lot of the investments to enable that are not yet been made. So I think we do need heat pumps. I think my approach would be to target them in homes that are well insulated, that have larger radiators to be able to, manage the heat pumps. And then, off the back of the investment that will inevitably come in the heat pump supply chain in the UK, we will need to try and, deploy them, for example, in homes that are worse insulated, in flats, because, at the moment they're pretty big. They take up a lot of space. So there's a whole range of and they're expensive, obviously. We shouldn't forget about that. The upfront cost of £10,000 at the moment. If you speak to some energy companies that are planning to invest in the heat pump supply chain, like Octopus, they're pretty confident that they can both reduce the cost and deal with some of these challenges in terms of implementation, but they need that market to be there and the kind of initial support from government in order to invest and innovate.
There is a different solution. You could use electricity to heat your central heating water, I live in a flat with electric central heating. It's a fairly well insulated flat, but it does get the radiators really hot because it's a heating element. But one of the shortcomings in the energy white paper is it's very vague about how much electricity we're actually going to need. And actually, your optimism about the electric vehicles program is not very sound on how much electricity we're going to need in order to charge all these electric vehicles, and how we're going to put the infrastructure in to do that. The government's expecting the market to do it. Well, it won't. It just won't happen.
I want to bring in Luke briefly, just on the heat pump point.
I'm not sure. I'd agree with much of what Sam said. I think one of the issues is that you do need. It is true that you should not be introducing heat pumps into homes that are energy inefficient. You need to do whole house retrofit, which is more expensive, and people need to know how to operate the technology. The worst thing you could do is actually introduce it into sort of someone a leaky home, someone who's on low incomes, because then they will find their bills are higher. But it is a proven technology. But there are barriers, as Sam said. There are improvements. But to be honest, it's the only game in town over the next decade if we're going to meet our targets. Although hydrogen will play a role, heat networks will have a role.
Get a whole lot of people to switch over to heat pumps, and they're complaining that their houses aren't warm enough anymore, and their bills have gone up. What kind of resistance are you going to get then? I mean, it's just there
is.
The whole programme.
Okay, I absolutely agree that none of these technologies are perfect, and they're all actually house by house specific, because blocks of flats. I mean, a heat pump is an air conditioning unit. That's really more or less what it is, and actually it makes quite a lot of noise as well. Actually, what we need is some innovation money to absolutely make heat pumps beautiful. Please, I like nice things, right? That look nice. Not like some disgusting sort of air conditioning unit. Secondly, not to make noise, because they're getting complaints from their neighbours, okay? And thirdly, to be more efficient. This sounds like a great innovation project. However, the sexiest thing that I have come across recently is wallpaper. Right? Infrared wallpaper and paint. And you paint your house, and if you look at the Octopus website, I mean, I'm quite serious. They are investing in innovation where you put paint on your wall and paint on your floor, and infrared heats you, not the room. Now, there's some limitations in that as well. And there's some limitations in the hydrogen thing. The point is actually that's what we should be looking at, is the new next technologies. I think heat pumps are fine, but it's quite an old-fashioned approach. We actually could really look at some of these other things and be a little bit more exciting and ambitious. Would you like the wallpaper?
definitely. That I'm interested to hear more about infrared wallpaper.
Yeah.
I think that's probably a good place to end our questions on infrared wallpaper. So
Exciting.
I think it just falls me to say a huge thanks to everyone for coming and for your questions and contributions. And thank you very much to all of our panellists. Please do watch Bernard's video, but also look up our report, which you can read the 70,000 word version, or the beautiful digital version, which I think is more like 5, right? 5.
Can I thank our devoted audience?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
To you.